And 9/11 came not from China, not from the former Soviet Union, not from Europe. 9/11 came from a divided, dysfunctional, angry, raging part of the world. And the critical threats to our interests in the future will come from that part of the world. And the Arab-Israeli issue is not the sole cause of it, but it is one issue that we need to get a better grip on trying to manage. And yet, I would argue, several days after a new president, our 44th, took the oath of office, we are neither feared, respected, or admired as much as we should be and need to be in an area of the world that is increasingly important to our national security. And success is the world's most compelling ideology. Not nationalism, not capitalism, not even democracy. Success is the world's most compelling ideology because success generates power and success generates constituents. And failure generates the opposite. And we today, even amidst the hope and expectation of a new president, are failing. So what I would like to do in the next 20 minutes is provide some unsolicited advice to the President of the United States and his eminently talented and able Secretary of State. I provide this advice with no agenda. I am not running for anything. I don't want to be elected to anything. I'm not interested in going back into the government. I had my 25 years. In fact, my new trope is that there ought to be term limits imposed on former advisors to secretaries of state and presidents when, in fact, the advice they provided over time is not judged to be smart enough, tough enough, and fair enough. Those three words you may hear several times during the next 20 minutes. Smart enough, tough enough, and fair enough. Because that is where we need to be in coping with what we are now involved in, which is an investment trap. We are caught in an investment trap in this region. We cannot fix it, and we cannot run away from it. We need to be smarter, tougher, and fairer in trying to manage it. So with all of this in mind, let me begin. Mr. President and Madam Secretary, I'm going to offer you 10 pieces of advice drawn from a quarter of a century analyzing, studying, writing, negotiating, and being in a part of the world which you now confront. First, and Mr. President, you know this better than anyone, governing is about choosing. That's what it means to govern. You decide what is important to you and what isn't. You were not elected to be the war president, and you were not elected to be the peace president. You were elected to be the president of trying to address America's broken house, the worst economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression, probably far worse than any of us or even you imagine, even now, as you try to create a hundreds of millions of dollars, billion-dollar stimulus package to try to create some measure of a pathway to an economic recovery. You're not the war president, you're not the peace president, but you cannot be a consequential president. None of our modern presidents were consequential without being a foreign policy president. So you need to choose which pieces of the foreign policy you want to invest in. The Middle East is one you cannot ignore. You've made a campaign commitment, which you intend to keep, which is by 2012 latest, a significant drawdown of American combat forces in Iraq. That commitment you must keep, and you will. You've talked about engaging with Iran, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. That's clearly a priority, because Iran sits at the nexus of everything that we care about in this region. And you've committed to keeping the American people secure, which is your ultimate objective, avoiding another catastrophic attack on the continental United States. And don't think for a minute that 9/11 is a footnote, some sort of historical piece which is somehow past. It hasn't. We may well be attacked again. Government is about choosing, and you're going to have to decide how much importance you want to attach to the Arab-Israeli issue. I would argue, Mr. President, it's one that needs to be managed because it resonates very broadly and deeply in this region, and you've got to find a way to get a hold of it. Second, you are in an investment trap in this region. You can't fix it, and you can't run away from it. So stay away from big ideas, regime change, preemptive and preventative wars about which you haven't planned or thought through, democratization, big Middle East summits. They're all going to fail. Prepare, do smart diplomacy, and set up opportunities which may allow you to succeed. Third, Mr. President and Madam Secretary, see the world the way it is, not the way you want it to be. If I could offer you one piece of advice to guide American foreign policy, it would be that. Because, Mr. President, we don't see the world the way it is. We see the world from a very unique and privileged vantage point. I'm from a real estate family. And the obvious rule of thumb in real estate is location, location, location. If you want to understand American foreign policy, Mr. President, think about this, because it explains everything. We have achieved a degree of physical security which is unprecedented in the history of modern nations. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish to our east and west. This one fact explains, so much, thank you, explains so much of the way we operate abroad. It explains our optimism, the notion that we believe any problem can be resolved. It explains our pragmatism, that diplomacy is the way to do it. It explains our naivete. We don't live on the knife's edge. We don't understand the fears and anxieties of small tribes who fight on a daily basis for existential survival and political identity. We have tremendous abundance even now during a time of economic crisis. This is absolutely critical because unless you see the world the way it is, you will never assess accurately what needs to be done in order to address the problems that you're trying to fix. And nowhere is this truer in the Arab-Israeli arena. Fourth, Mr. President, look to the past before you look to the future. The great historian A.J.P. Taylor once said that the only lesson of history is that there are no lessons. It's an interesting formulation, Mr. President and Madam Secretary, but those who ignore history completely will find that history proves to be a very cruel and unforgiving teacher. History is the best antidote there is to omniscience, the notion that you, Mr. President, somehow know it all, or omnipotence, the notion, Mr. President, that you can do it all. You must study the past. If I were to ask you, Mr. President, how many Americans were killed during our occupation of Japan between 1945 and 1952, what do you suppose the answer is? The answer is none. Not a single American died as a consequence of hostile Japanese action during 7 years of an American occupation. Why do I mention this? I mention this because what were we thinking when we decided to embark on this trillion-dollar social science project called Iraq? What were we thinking about the costs and implications? How many forces would need to be deployed? What would happen if you ripped the lid off a centralized authoritarian governmental structure